I wouldn't think I have time for a question. Please come by me later if you have a question.
And we'll have some discussion time too, that's well the social hour later, so we'll have plenty of time to also talk about your masks.
Good afternoon. To start us off, I'd like you to please raise your hand if you personally identify as a scientist. All right, that's most of us. Now, please raise your hand, shifting gears a little bit, if you personally identify as religious. Okay, about a fourth to a third of the room. That's not the distribution I thought that I would see, and this is representative, it turns out, of a broader cultural trend whereby religious people in the U.S. tend to be underrepresented in science relative to their numbers in the general population. Now, this is true regardless of whether being religious is defined as reporting a particular religious affiliation, like Catholicism, Protestantism, Judaism, or reporting that one believes in God. In each case, the percentage of people who identify in the U.S. as religious pales, or actually is a lot significantly greater than the percentage of people in the U.S. Who are scientists who identify as religious. So whether you, depending on how you operationalize religion, religious people in the U.S. population are far more numerous than religious people in the sciences. And I should note that the majority of religious people in the U.S. do identify themselves as Christians. So why might this be the case, that there's this discrepancy between religious individuals in the general population versus in scientific fields? One possible explanation is a simple lack of scientific ability, that religious people may be less competent at science than non-religious people. But there is some evidence that the higher one scores on measures of religiosity, the lower one tends to score on measures of analytical thinking capabilities. And indeed, in 2011, in his book, Thinking Fast and Slow, Nobel Prize-winning psychologist Daniel Kahneman popularized the terms System 1 and System 2 to refer to different ways of processing information. System 1 involves thinking fast, if you will, so relying on one's gut feelings, one's intuitions, a lot of processes that are considered implicated within religious faith. System 2, on the other hand, is thinking more slowly, rational, deliberate, analytical, logical, all these words that are stereotypical of people who might think in more scientific ways. So if relying on System 2 methods of processing necessitates relying less on System 1 and vice versa, then it could be that people who identify as religious simply have less experience, are less fluent in using these more scientific parts of the brain. A second explanation has less to do with ability and more to do with interest in pursuing scientific spaces. That is, religious people in the U.S., particularly Christians, for whom controversies about science and religion in the media and popular culture loom large, may come away from this discourse feeling as though science just isn't for people like them. Perhaps science conflicts with religious people's deeply held values. And so religious people might be thinking about their faith and science and the relationship between the two in much the same way as is depicted in these cartoons, as two schools of thought going in opposite directions, or as outright wrestling matches. Today, though, I'm going to introduce a third possible explanation, that religious people, particularly Christians, may have just as much ability and just as much interest in pursuing science as their non-religious counterparts, but they know that other people, particularly in the U.S., do not see their group in that way. They're aware of societally ingrained stereotypes that Christians are less scientifically able and less scientifically interested. And this awareness of stereotypes leads them to think that they wouldn't belong or be welcomed into scientific majors in college career paths later on. So to give you a little bit of background for how I got interested in this question in the first place, in the winter of 2011, I took a vacation to Morocco, a predominantly Muslim country, to visit some friends. And in the course of my trip, my friends and I had a random conversation about the relationship between religion and science. And I said something about how in the US, most people think of religion and science as conflicting. My friends were shocked, and I was pretty shocked that they were shocked. And as someone who has researched stereotyping and social identities for my entire career, I started to think maybe there are aspects of the sociocultural context in the US that reinforce these perceptions, whether or not a conflict actually exists, and that might even be pushing individuals of particular religious backgrounds away from science. So my colleagues and I tested this explanation about awareness of stereotypes leading to feelings of not belonging in two studies that I'm going to briefly show you today. In the first study, we had Christian and non-Christian adult participants complete a 10-question task that was exactly the same, except for one group of participants, we described the task as a measure of scientific reasoning, and for another group of participants, we described it as a measure of intuitive thought capability. We expected that describing the task as measuring scientific reasoning ability would seem a bit more threatening and a bit more consistent of stereotypes that, oh, religious people don't belong here, than something like intuitive thought, which is very much, in Kahneman's terms, a system 1 kind of description. So the 10 problems were measures of analytical reasoning at heart, and participants had to look at 3 different words, 10 sets of 3 words, and identify the 4th word that was related to the first 3. Let's try it just for fun. So the 3 words were golf, beans, and envy. Shout out the 4th word.
Green.
Awesome. All right, how about barrel, root, and belly? Right, it's happening at the social hour today. We're in business. So the job of participants was to see how many of these problems they could solve correctly. And again, we looked at differences between Christians and non-Christians who either got the description of the task as measuring scientific reasoning or intuitive thought. Again, the exact same task. In the second study, we tested this possibility in a more direct way. We actually gave participants a supposedly real op-ed article that said that most Americans think that Christianity and science either conflict with one another or that they can coexist. And this article was accompanied by statistics about either the high or low percentage of religious people in sciences, or the high or low percentage of Americans who think that religion and science can go together and that it's possible for a religious person to be a scientist. And again, these were Christian and non-Christian participants. The results of both these experiments are remarkably consistent with one another. In the first study, which is on the right-hand panel, those who got the description of the task as measuring scientific reasoning among those participants, Christians underperformed relative to non-Christians by almost 2 points, a difference that entirely disappeared when the task, the exact same task, was described as a measure of intuitive thought. In the second study over on this left-hand panel, again, Christians underperformed relative to non-Christians when we read the article about most people thinking that their religion conflicts with science. But this difference did not emerge among those who read the article about religion and science being thought to coexist. These results suggest that Christians and non-Christians are just as capable as one another of performing well on tasks that might tap into scientific and analytical reasoning. But if stereotypes about Christians are explicitly dispelled, then you see performance differences among the groups that are a bit more equal. And so this suggests that regardless of Christians' personal interest or ability in science, that debunking negative stereotypes of one's group can go a long way in increasing feelings of belonging. Now, given that Christians are a majority of the US population, and very few people here, I'm guessing, would argue that they're a stigmatized group in society, why does and should this matter? I argue that it does for a couple of reasons. First, that underrepresented groups in society as a whole, people of color, people with disabilities, women, LGBTQ individuals, but that also this would include making Christians, religious individuals as a whole, feel more welcome in these environments. Thank you. Yeah, so that's a really good question, and I do think that there are particular groups of religious people who truly do think that science conflicts with their religious beliefs. The people in my studies were more those who don't necessarily perceive there to be a conflict, who would otherwise be motivated to do well in science and to pursue those disciplines, but just don't because of their awareness of these stereotypes. But for those groups of individuals, I think, again, this is where representation could be really important. So Francis Collins, who was the former director of the NIH, who just stepped down, is an outspoken Christian and is probably somebody who members of these communities could look to see, well, here's people who think like I do, at least in some ways, who are pursuing science and who are buying into these scientific facts. So I think having more role models in the field who are religious could really help in that way. And also, I think the way that science is often described in society, and something I'm working on with some of my students right now, is we think of scientists as working by themselves, being really independent and competitive, things that are seen as at odds with a lot of religious beliefs and religious practices. And so maybe framing science in more interdependent and group-oriented ways could help get even the groups of religious people who are really resistant to these facts at first on board, so long as they start thinking about how science can comport with their social identities that are important to them.
Thank you.
Thanks, and any questions later, feel free, you know where to find me, and my email is just rios@ohio.edu. Thanks.
Okay, and then you have a few minutes to get around to the restroom really quickly, and then we're going to segue right into our final keynote of the afternoon. I'm guessing a little bit of troubleshooting is happening right now about that keynote.